going.
MT, just to let you know, we are ready when you are. No rush, but we are recording, and I think we have all our tech issues out of the way for now.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm hoping that some more people will sign in, but until then, we'll go ahead and get the meeting started since we have reached our designated time. Thank you, everyone who's with us so far for joining us for today's meeting. I do have a few announcements to make regarding a teleconferenced meeting. First of all, I ask that participants please keep their phones on mute until they are recognized to speak, or your device on mute until you are recognized to speak. Task force members will be allowed to ask questions or comments at any time during the meeting. The next issue is whenever you want to speak, please use the Zoom hand raise feature to speak. Now, for those of you who don't know how to do the Zoom hand raise speak, if you'll go to the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen, and a thing should come up saying participants. Click on that, on participants, and then you'll see a screen open to your right. At the bottom of that screen, you'll see a little dot, see a option called raise hand. If you hit that, then the hand goes up. What that does is keeps everybody that wants to speak in order so that I can look at who's in order here on the screen and then call the next person up. Do I have any questions about how to use the raise hand feature? Okay, thank you. The next issue is if the video conference is disconnected at any time during the meeting shall be stopped and reconvened once the audio and video is restored. If communications are unable to be restored within 15 minutes, items remaining on the agenda will be placed on our next meeting date, and that date we will be discussing here at the end of this meeting. For anyone who is not a task force member that is watching in on the meeting, please bear with us. A process is being developed to include public comment. We are almost there, just hadn't got there yet. We are very hopeful that that process will be finalized before our next meeting, which will be in October. Until then, we will not be able to allow comment from the public, but we are hoping to get that underway in our next meeting in October. At this point, I will go ahead and call our meeting to order. From the agenda, the first issue on our meeting is RFP selection process, and I will call on Kenton Sudel to speak on that issue.
Thank you, MT. Members of the task force, I just wanted to give you a quick update on kind of where we're at. You know, we had talked about at our last meeting, reviewed the selection criteria for the consultant and had reviewed the scope of work. That also occurred with the city manager's community policing work group. So I appreciate everybody's comments and input that we got on that. We did get that incorporated into a request for proposals that council approved at the last council meeting on the 15th. That RFP was issued on the 16th, the next day. So it's currently right now out there and available for potential proposers to look at. We use our system bidsync.com, and that's where, just like any other bidding process the city has, that's who, you know, potential consultants have to go through. I know that we've been given different names and things that we've looked up, and other groups such as, you know, for example, the 21CP group. We've sent emails to the different groups that we've received, letting them know that that's out there. The responses are due on October the 7th. And our hope is that once the responses come in, that we would be able to get through the city's procurement process and potentially have a contract ready to go back to council sometime in early November. So let me talk just for a minute and want to give you an update on kind of what that process looks like. So per the city's procurement policies, we have to form a selection committee, and per our policies, there's a city manager designee, a finance department designee, and then whatever department is involved, there's a designee. And then basically whoever else the city manager names to be on that selection committee. So we were anticipating asking members of both the mayor's task force and the city manager's working group. We anticipate asking for volunteers. I'm going to do that here in a moment, but the thought is we would probably, meet our policy required members, but also have a couple of members from each of the groups be on the selection committee. And I just want to talk really briefly about what that entails. If you're on a selection committee for the city, typically that just means that you're involved in, you have to go through and read all of the proposals that we receive, whether that's 1 or 100. Go through, discuss the proposals with other committee members, ask questions. It may involve checking references or doing other research. But we anticipate the process would look like that. And it really depends on how many proposals we receive. If we only received 1 or 2 or 3 proposals, we very well may come back with all the proposers giving, sort of a final presentation to our larger groups. But if there's, let's say there's 5, 6 proposals, we anticipate that the selection committee generally would narrow that down. Maybe there's someone who's not qualified, or they didn't meet all the requirements of the proposal or something like that, and be able to kind of narrow it down and bring back the most qualified firms back to the larger groups kind of for final presentation and all. But that's just kind of an update where we're at on that. So again, the responses will be back October 7th. We will, once we receive those and kind of know how many we're looking at, that'll drive the process just a little bit. But ultimately then, once the selection committees looked at it and our larger committees have looked at it, we would forward a recommendation to City Council for their approval. So last thing I'll say on that, that's kind of the last of what I have to say on the update. But the last thing I'll say is just, if anyone's interested, and I know we've already had a few people indicate they're interested. If you're interested in serving on the selection committee and reviewing those proposals in more detail, and everyone will have an opportunity to look at them. It's just, we having 45 people try to go through and take the time to look at it may not be reasonable. So, but if you're interested in serving on that selection committee, please send an email or give a call to Sharita Bryce and let her know. She's trying to compile the list for us. And there's been a couple folks from each of the groups that have reached out already. So just please make sure you do that as soon as possible, because depending on how many volunteers we have, we'll have to kind of figure out how we select the members for that. But that's all I had today. Just want to kind of give you an update where we're at. So we're off and running, and hopefully we get some good proposals on October the 7th.
Are there any questions for Mr. Sudel? Okay, thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.
Next up is a presentation by Joshua Harris Teal regarding the public's examination of the Oklahoma City Police Department. Joshua, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, MT. Is it possible for the host to give me the ability to do screen sharing? You can do that 1 or 2 ways. You can allow everybody.
Yes, sir. I got you. Just give me 1 second.
So, Jack.
You should be good to go, sir.
Thank you. Alrighty, so what we wanted to do today is kind of just approach our role on this task force in terms of that being the public. There was a presentation. We thank Chief Gurley for doing that presentation last week, where he shared a lot of information on what's going on with the OKC Police Department, the way they've created, the way they think about some of these different processes, and just kind of gave us an in-depth examination from their perspective my feeling is we want to share what we thought while we were looking into that presentation. We want to be extremely thankful to Chief Gurley. In examining this, we want to make sure that we are very well researched. And so we utilize the sources that was provided by them. Another source that was used or cited by the OFP to put together this presentation. This is about sharing our perspective, making sure that you guys are aware of the research, and then formulating more questions so that we can all be on the same page as we move forward in this process. We have a pretty simple agenda. The first is research from the ICP. You guys might remember that's the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which talks about de-escalation training. The second is we're going to review those numbers on de-escalation incidents as provided to us by the city for a request I sent out. You guys should see that in your email as well when you got the agenda. Third is we're going to look at police homicide, and we're going to try to get an examination of how Oklahoma and OKCPD compares nationally. And then the last part is qualified immunity. That was something that came up in the last conversation, so we wanted to look at that as well. The public's perception and whether or not that equals the public good. For the purposes of establishing this presentation, we want to make sure that we take some direct quotes from the ICP's research to understand, one, what policing is, two, what that de-escalation training actually looks like and what it means, and that's going to help us formulate an opinion. So the first couple of quotes that we want to make sure that we understand is police are defined by their ability to use force. It is their ability to use force and the public's expectation that they do so if necessary to handle situations that separates them, being the police, from all other occupations. The use of force continues to be central and increasingly controversial, the defining role of the police. Notwithstanding its importance, we still relatively know little about how, when, and under what circumstances police officers use force. And unfortunately, one of the most consistently documented findings regarding police use of force is our lack of knowledge about it and the considerable problems associated with data collection. I will say that this is about a 69-page document. I'm more than willing to make sure I get that over to Sharita so that you guys can read through this whole document yourself. Again, we just wanted to take a couple of quotes from it so that you guys can understand where our foundation was for setting up this presentation. A few more things. There's no uniformly accepted definition of de-escalation within the policing field. De-escalation has become a catch-all of sorts, symbolizing a different, more progressive policing approach for handling potential use of force encounters. Most de-escalation training emphasizes strategy for the prevention and management of violence and aggression, and the large estimated percentage of fatal encounters with police where the suspect does not have a firearm, which is around 44% according to Zimring, boldly predicts that such encounters, i.e. the police killings, could be cut in half without compromising the safety of the officer. The last couple points that we want to hit on is a review by Cynthia Lum and her colleagues in 2016 reveals that many of the recommendations of the President's task force, including de-escalation training, are not based on a strong body of empirical evidence. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, Landers stated in 2017, he argues by sending police officers to de-escalation training courses, chiefs and sheriffs have risked these men and women becoming hesitant about using force, and further, while de-escalation concepts are practical and effective in some situations, they are useless and even dangerous in others. The only agreement among de-escalation training supports that critics appear to be, to supporters and critics, appears to be that more information is needed to determine its effectiveness. And again, that's from England Circuits from 2017. When we look at Oklahoma's numbers, this was kind of the question that I had, right? How many total incidents occurred? So 1,226 different incidents were reviewed. That doesn't necessarily equate to how many occurred. That was the ones that rose to the level of needing to review. We don't know how many could have been reviewed. I wouldn't expect the police to also have an answer for that because those situations occur the way that they occur. And of those 1,226, we want to look at these numbers and kind of understand this breakdown or maybe have questions about this breakdown. There were 76 officers with inappropriate de-escalation ruling. So that's a very, very small number of folks who had incidents reviewed that actually said that their behavior was inappropriate. So we kind of want to know from that, what are the determining factors that we're looking at? How are we reviewing this? Who exactly is reviewing this? What guidelines or what threshold does an officer involved situation with de-escalation have to meet in order for it to be something that needs to be reviewable and or punishable? 62 of those 75 incidents with an inappropriate de-escalation training or de-escalation ruling actually received infractions. And so again, we're kind of breaking that number down. We went from 1,200 to 75, now we're at 62. We have a breakdown of those warnings. 65 were remedial trainings and training reviews. 13 were counseling issues. 13 were class 1s, 2 class 2s, 1 class 3, which also includes a 3-day suspension without pay and probation for a year. And then we see at the very bottom that no officer has been terminated due to inappropriate de-escalation training or de-escalation situations. That, I think, tells us one or two things, right? It poses the question, either we have a system in place that is doing a really great job at retraining these officers, or two, we don't have a good enough system that are kind of catching those bad apples to make sure that they are receiving the training or the critiques or the punishment that they deserve for being in these situations. And so that creates a lot of questions, and that's something that I think that we should honestly examine a little bit further, because one of the big questions that we've had in terms of Black Lives Matter leadership is, if de-escalation training is as good as they say it is, then what is the issue that allows us to be second in the nation? That actually brings us to our second point. So we have unfortunately had 48 people killed by police since 2013. I know that this number has actually been disputed before by our chief of police, which actually led the Frontier to do research showing exactly how many of those, and I don't know if this is going to pull up for us. This should pull up for us. There we go. How many of those actually happened and were involved in Oklahoma City police, did involve an Oklahoma City police officer. So the Frontier actually did research for every single name on that list. As you can see, there is a news article directly connected to it. There is one story in 2017 where it was an OHP officer and an OKCPD police officer who shot someone when they were killed. And so there's some kind of speculation on if we want to do 48 or 47 and a half in terms of identifying who is to blame necessarily, or who would receive credit in terms of that shooting, right? We want to make sure that we aren't putting any deaths on the hands of the OKC Police Department that's not supposed to. But according to that story, both an OKCPD officer and an OHP officer fired shots. That number seems really high. And so we were trying to do research further, especially when we talk about nationally. When we look at the numbers for Oklahoma specifically, we see that there were 170 shootings since 2015, right? And so that's all over the state of Oklahoma, 48 of those being in Oklahoma City, which is just kind of interesting to think about. When you think about cities like New Orleans, you see that our numbers are higher than there. When you think about cities like Chicago, you can even see that our numbers are still higher. And when it's based on population size, that really kind of creates more questions than it does answers in terms of even Washington and everything that they have going on there. You still see that number being lower than the number of shootings that we've had since just 2015. So we understand that there's a problem, but we have to figure out kind of what the solution is and how we get to a point and where we're able to see just kind of what the issues are that exist within Oklahoma City's police department? Is it the police department? Is it the de-escalation training? Is it something that's going on with our community? I know Chief Gurley suggested that unfortunately the amount of meth that is used in our state could be one of the contributing factors. Not understanding completely what the contributing factors are, but understanding that there are situations in which officers have to use lethal force, but are we doing it correctly? Can we be doing it better? Are there ways for us to do it better? We talked about qualified immunity, and I did want to make sure that we included this in our presentation because one, I think that if we have a situation in which officers are personally held liable for their actions, then we have one where we hope responsibility will be something that is focused on more. Right. Now, we can't ensure that, but what we can say pretty confidently is, according to the Pew Research Center, qualified immunity, or the ability to sue a police officer in order to hold them accountable for excessive use of force, is something that is widely supported across the board. And I know that we've had conversations about whether or not that would dissuade people from becoming police officers. And you kind of just have to ask yourself the question is, if an officer or if a person seeking to be an officer is dissuaded by the fact that they might have to take responsibility for their actions, are they approaching that job the way that they should be? And that's kind of, I think, the general consensus of the public. When you look at 2/3 of Americans say that civilians need the power to sue a police officer, that number actually increases to 86% when you talk about Black adults. This being specifically because African-American men between the ages of 20 and 40 are more likely to be killed by police officers or during police encounters than any. That's kind of where you see a lot of that disparity in terms of race, unfortunately. 58% of Americans say the police around the country do an excellent job of protecting people from crime, which is little change from 4 years ago when we saw it at 62%, just a small decrease. However, there's been double-digit decline in the shares of people who say police forces do an excellent job or a good job of using the right amount of force in situations. This can be for one or two reasons. One, just because it's a lot more public whenever there is a police-involved shooting, because that is something that goes viral, for lack of a better word. When it happens, then more Americans are seeing it, but it's not necessarily a new issue, right? The numbers are pretty consistent from what we've seen in terms of the unfortunate realities when officers have to be involved in homicide situations. But the public is starting to lose faith in the officer's ability to be trusted in those situations. And I think when we talk about fixing relationships, we can't just fix the numbers exactly. We also have to fix the perception. I think that is at the heart of community policing, making sure that we are not only making the community safer, but we're making the community feel safer, and we're making sure that officers are trusted and welcomed in those situations so that we can help with the investigation process, with the policing atmosphere for that community, and making sure that crime is brought down across all barriers. When we look at this, when we look at these numbers, we say far more Americans, is about 73%, say that spending on their local police should stay about the same as it is now. 42% believe that it's increased, a 42% increase from its current level at 31%, while Black adults are more likely than whites to favor cuts in police budgets. Fewer than half of Black adults, 42%, say that spending on police in their areas should be reduced. What we see, and kind of with this defund the police movement, is not necessarily that we believe that the officers should have their budgets completely cut, but that those funds should be reallocated into different programs that focus more on policing and less on, and more on public perception, honestly, than it does on necessarily some of the projects that they have going on. The militarization of police, we know that a lot of that money comes from grants from the federal government, but the public doesn't necessarily know that that's where that money comes from. And so when they see the barricades or when they see the military vehicles, then they are concerned that that is where their tax dollars are going. So one great way is education, but on the back end of that education aspect, we want to make sure that we're showing, hey, we're funding these programs. I know Paco has a great program with lots of officers who are focused completely on community policing. They're not in charge of doing the interactions with folks and dealing with crimes, so to say. And that's something that's great, but that's not something that the public has a lot of information about. So what we see, again, reallocation is a very popular idea. Defunding isn't a very popular idea. So how can we find out where this money could be better spent is a question that the public has for us. Wrapping up here, you see that this survey, again, Pew Research, finds overwhelmingly there's favor requiring police to be trained in nonviolent alternatives to deadly force. 92% of the public supports that. But 90% also support a database that tracks officers' abuse or misconduct. We know in Oklahoma that's one of our biggest issues. An officer can be a bad actor, be removed from that police department, and then go to the next town over or a different part of the state and get a job. That's something that is really concerning to a lot of people. One of the most egregious being Officer Betty Shelby. That's something that the public sees. And again, though this may be a very small instance or maybe a small occurrence of this happening, it's one of those ones that become very public. So in our terms or in our attempt to fix community policing, we have to make sure that we are not only holding police officers accountable as task force members in the public, but that the police officers are holding themselves accountable. We know that they don't like bad officers any more than we do. So working on instituting a database like that tracks that abuse and misconduct is something that would be very popular within our community. 75% of the population polled supports citizens advisory boards. We obviously have one now. I'm interested to hear the explanation that we're going to get on that and kind of a review of that coming up. 74% want officers to come from their communities. If you know the community, if you're personally invested in the community, if you have relationships within the community, it's a lot easier for you to police it. And 74% believe that chokeholds and strangleholds, I said strongholds, I apologize for that typo, should be a crime. We've seen just way too many incidences of people being choked. We know that in the situations there's very high stress, but we have to make sure that we're using the right approaches and the right alternatives. And again, these are all things that are very widely popular, that are simple changes that the police department can make internally in order to build a better relationship with the community. That wraps up the majority of my presentation. Josh, did I leave anything out? Any page you want me to go back to?
No, I mean, I suppose we should just, if there are questions about some of the data and whatnot, one of the things we want to mention is that we've done a lot of research outside of the sources that we've used here, but that we thought it was best to actually limit it to sources that we know that either Chief Gurley suggested. So the research that we found from the first several slides was actually from the International Association Chiefs of Police, which was great. And this was actually just first published at the end of January of this year. So it's really, really recent and covers actually 40 years of feedback and data on de-escalation policies and trainings. And the other, of course, was provided by the FOP, I believe several months ago in a video that they had made. So starting with research material that could be considered to be common ground, we figured it would be best as a way to start the discussion about what the problems are.
Definitely. Our approach here is that we want to make sure we're using information that doesn't look like it's biased or skewed to our opinion, but it's something that all of us can agree on. And so if we can, BLM can come together with the Chief of Police and the FOP and utilize the same information to make these presentations, that's what we wanted to start the conversation on. Again, we have more information that we hope to provide you all with over the coming months. We've done hours and hours and hours of research on this to make sure that we are providing as much information as possible so that we can be effective as a task force.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua and Josh, for your presentation. First, let me ask the question before we proceed any further. Joshua, is it your intent to make your presentation available so that we can give it to all task force members?
Yes, we will be making the presentation available and the supporting documents available for everybody on the task force.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. Now, the next question I'd like to ask is, Chief Gorley, would you like to respond now, or would you rather respond after we allow everybody else to ask questions?
I think for the most part, I mean, the main point of the presentation was looking at things, whatever data is there that we can do to improve. And that was the part of the presentation that I keyed on the most, is that's why we're here as a task force together and look at ways that we can do better. And I said before in my presentation, my goal would be to not have any of these encounters anymore. So if there's things we can do to avoid that, then that's what we need to be working toward. And you know, that would be, obviously it's probably an unrealistic goal, but that ultimately would be the goal, is so that, you know, you don't have that impact on the community or the police officers themselves. And but that's all I'd like to say in regards to that. And I appreciate the presentation.
Very good. Then we'll move on to questions from membership. And I notice we have one from Ed.
Thank you, MT. Joshua, thank you for the presentation. It was helpful. I appreciate that. Just a question, and maybe Chief Gorley, you could answer this. What is the methodology for documenting and collecting the data of use of force incidents by officers on individual calls or encounters? How do we gather that data?
Our procedures require that anything beyond routine handcuffing is reported to a supervisor. And, you know, now with body cameras on those interactions, we have, you know, not only that method of the officer reporting, self-reporting, but then we have reviews of the cameras as well that can catch anything that may be missed. I have software that once that supervisor is notified, it generates an incident in this administrative tracking software, and every incident is investigated and looked into by that supervisor. It goes through a process. It goes through the chain of command where it's reviewed all the way up to the division commander, and then it's sent to what's called a use of force screening committee. That use of force screening committee meets regularly and reviews all uses of force and makes any determination on issues that may arise, you know, whether, like you saw in the slide on the presentation on some of the de-escalation issues, where it could be training reviews where the officer goes back and gets more training. It could be that the use of force was justified and appropriate as it was. And so all of that is documented in the software, also what the use of force screening committee does as well. But basically, the key to that is anytime something goes beyond routine handcuffing, an administrative investigation is started.
So it relies upon a verbal notification, as opposed to we don't have for example, a specific form that's a standard along with all of our other reporting forms, where just on every incident where there's a contact, where we just check the box, no force used, or handcuff or scuffle or something that long that goes along with it.
It does, and it's all electronic. It's inside the administrative tracking software, and it works just almost exactly like you described. The supervisor goes through and does that checklist. They also, you know, the supervisors are going to review reports as well, and so, you know, that information in the officer's report too will be entered into the administrative software as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, before I move on to the next person with their hand up, I want to make sure for those who joined us late that they know how to get in line to speak. If you will go to the bottom of your screen, you should see a option called Participants. If you will click on that, a dialog box will come up on the right hand of your screen, and at the bottom it has Raise Hand. If you'll click that, that will put you in line so I know who to call on next. Now that I've said that, Dexter Nelson is showing up next to respond.
Thank you. I just had a quick question for Mr. Harris. In your evaluation, the what was it, 1,200 and some odd uses of force you looked at? That was from a 1-year period, is that correct?
I believe so. When it was provided to me, I was just given the numbers. And so I think Chief Gurley, I think that might have been just from 2018, but Chief Gurley, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
Those numbers you were given were only de-escalation, that numbers that were evaluated, and they cover about a 2-year period between when we started in 2018 until the most current time frame, that we had the data, which if we go up until this current date, there's some administrative reviews that haven't been all the way through the process, but the numbers were up until current time frames.
So since 2018, I apologize.
Yes, and again, they're only de-escalation incidents. That's the only thing you were provided is the actual de-escalation incident itself that's evaluated. Those are evaluated separately from the uses of force.
Yeah, and the only reason I bring that up is the same point I had last time is in looking at uses of force and de-escalation and all of this, you still have to consider the definition of use of force. It's not standardized around the country, and every department considers the use of force differently than other departments. And Oklahoma City has one of the most stringent definitions of use of force. So I hope you're considering that definition when you compare Oklahoma City to other police departments and in the numbers of uses of force that they count, and also the escalations.
Right, but I think, like as Chief Gurley just pointed out, this is separate. These are separate numbers. There's use of force and there's de-escalation incidents. So these are just de-escalation incidents, not the use of force incidents. For everybody on the call, we do want to make sure those are different. As we focus on de-escalation training, again, that's kind of very broad. As you saw in the research from the IACP, there's not a very clear definition or universal definition of what de-escalation is. And so as it is defined by OKCPD, since 2018, we've had 1,226 of those incidences occur.
Right, and I'm just making the point that there's also no clear definition on what a use of force is because, yeah, they separate them out, use of force and de-escalation, but just making the fact that there's no definition for either one of those is all I'm pointing out.
And I just wanted to add to that too. You won't find comparisons of de-escalation because we're the only agency that actually evaluates our de-escalation. Other agencies are wanting to do that, and there's research being done on our department right now because we're the only ones that have that data. So you won't find specific de-escalation data like what we have because no other agency is evaluating it.
Right, and that was another part of the research that I hope you all pulled from it was that, there is a lot more research that needs to be done on de-escalation in terms of finding out how effective it is in different communities. And so as Chief Gurley mentioned, they are being examined and they're having their processes looked at because we need to find out like how effective is this? Is it something that we need every police station to be doing? Is there some changes or tweaks that we need to be making? And I think that's a lot of the point that we're here for.
Okay, next up to speak is Garland Pruitt.
I think the manner in which we're receiving data has a lot to do with how we document and move forward. Now, if we don't have a specific definition for de-escalation, we don't have a specific definition for the use of force. I'm gonna just give an example. I called earlier today to get the numbers of how many folks have died in police custody, and it's all in how they document it. The first numbers I was given was 7. And so I said to myself, that doesn't sound right. And so the reason I said it didn't sound right, because we were aware of more than that possibly have considered to be died in police custody. So if they're not actually charged with the death, they have a tendency to not be on the list at 10 died in police custody. Either they killed them or they died in police custody. So documentation of how we collect the data, present the data, makes a difference. So that's why we can have a discrepancy as to how many have actually died in police custody with that number that was being disputed. So you understand what I'm saying? Just the documentation alone plays a role in how we move forward. If we are unable to accept that a number that we didn't just pull out a hose closed, we didn't create the number and it's being disputed, we understand that in order to cover myself or appear to be a certain way, it's okay. We understand you're supposed to protect yourself. That's the case. But what we're after is being able to seek a difference in the manner in which they receive the data, a difference in a clarification as to police force, de-escalation. If we were to ask, we understand that policing is totally different from street. So if we was to ask the average person on the street about what he might have just observed, just an example, this past Monday, today is Wednesday, I saw the police bring someone out of the library in a manner that possibly could have been done differently. So de-escalation is an issue. Overly aggressiveness is the issue. I think the thing that we're dealing with, not only at the local level, but at the national level, has everything to do with those in control with power and influence and a gun moving a little bit more aggressive than they could be, should be, and ought to be. And so personally, that's what I think the majority of our concern is that at the end of all of that aggressiveness, someone is not injured, killed, or died. So the manner in which you collect that data and the manner in which that data is reported is most important.
Thank you, Garland.
Thank you.
Next up is Joshua Higginbotham.
Can I real quick, Josh, if you don't mind? That's two really good points. One was transparency. Without having a base of information that we as the public can start from, then it is going to have those discrepancies whenever we look at any of the data and whenever we have the conversations. That's going to make it harder for us to either defend the actions of police officers who are justified or understand when those actions aren't justified. So that transparency component, we have to establish a good foundation in order for us to have true transparency. And then the other part is when we talk about de-escalation, if the de-escalation training is phenomenal, then that's great. But what happens when that de-escalation fails? What happens on the other end of that de-escalation training or that de-escalation when the de-escalation doesn't work? Are we taking the proper steps in the progression of force? And that is something that our community is very interested in knowing, and being able to get that information can only come from, internal sources, right? You guys reviewed the videos. Yes, they did a phenomenal job. They were very calm. They tried to ask them to relax several times. They tried to establish a dialogue. But on the other end of that, was there too much aggression used? It's something that we have to think about, because we can say they did a great attempt at getting the situation de-escalated, but if they didn't do a good job at making sure the escalation of force afterwards was acceptable, then that's something that's going to create issues with that community. Go ahead, Josh. Sorry.
So to go back to Garland's point, actually, one of the things that the term that has been used that I don't quite understand is the notion of a routine handcuffing, because it seems to me that by definition, a handcuffing is never routine. That is in just the course of, so I don't know what, if there is a definition, and I'm being sincere with my question, is there a definition of what constitutes a routine handcuffing? And so that's the first question. The second one is, since there is no standard or national level definition of whether it be use of force, of de-escalation, whatever else, what are we basing this judgment call that our use of force definitions and things like that are the most stringent? That is compared to what, if there's no national standard? So I guess that first one, what exactly defines a routine handcuffing? And the second one, if there's no nationalized standard, how do we know that we have stringent standards?
Joshua, if I could try to answer the first part for you, simply because I sat on the use of force committee more recently than Chief Gorley, and basically anything other than, so we do feel that we have one of the most stringent standards because, you know, you're right. A lot of these circumstances aren't very routine. Routine handcuffing would be when an individual complies with you, they turn around, they give you their hands, and you simply handcuff them with no use of force whatsoever. They comply 100%, and you're making an arrest or you're detaining a person, and you're able to put handcuffs on them without any type of escalation or use of force. Anything other than that, if the person doesn't want to go, if they push the officer, if they go to the ground, anything that is not full compliance on that handcuffing to us is a use of force. And every one of those has worked. So if that individual, whether they're intoxicated or on drugs, whatever situation, if they don't comply 100%, turn around, give you their hands, and the officer is able to place handcuffs on them without taking them to the ground or without using any type of other techniques, that to us is routine handcuffing. So if you can imagine anything other than that, any strikes, blows, use of pepper spray is a use of force. OC spray, that is a use of force for us. A baton, and obviously firearms is the most obvious, but that's, if that explains it a little bit, anything more than full compliance would be a use of force.
Okay, so just to clarify on that, so what Garland referred to, that incident is going to be like documented.
Well, you know, and I didn't see the incident, but I can envision, you know, an individual being forcefully, maybe he's handcuffed already, but they're forcefully having to put him in a police car. Yeah, that's a use of force. That needs to be reported to the supervisor. A full use of force packet is going to be reviewed. The use of force committee will determine whether the force use was justified and appropriate. And if it's not, then that officer is going to be disciplined for it. So what's even worse is that if that use of force is not reported, if that officer does not report that use of force, and we catch that on a body cam video later on, because supervisors and watch commanders, they review videos routinely to make sure that there's a checks and balances, and we identify a use of force that was not reported, that's a big deal. And then it becomes not just a use of force investigation, but an administrative investigation to see what policies were violated.
And what technique of sampling is actually used for the body cams? So is it randomized sampling of the video footage? Because I assume that supervisors want 4 hours of video, right?
Right. Yeah, that's too many hours. Basically, that's something that is contractual. It is something that we negotiate through the FOP, and it is random. They take a random sampling of certain officers, and believe they do monthly reviews. I'd have to go back and check the contract and the policy, and they determine whether, okay, is everything going okay? Because basically the philosophy behind that is that if we see inappropriate action in a random viewing of a body cam video, then we can start asking questions. Okay, they performed an inappropriate act. Is this routine for this officer? Now that gives us justification to pull more videos and determine whether this was just a random thing that can be addressed one time, or whether this is non-compliance of policy on a daily basis. So it gives us that avenue for investigation.
And is that tied to any sort of statistical tracking of, like, if you have at a particular time of day or at a particular shift, if incidents of violence, or let's say a non-routine handcuffing, if they tend to group or cluster at certain times of day, on certain shifts and things like that, does the random sampling come from that shift, or does it adjust?
Each watch commander, say it's a third shift watch commander, they would review the videos for their shift. So that's going to be third shift. That's going to be 9:30 p.m. to 7:30 in the morning. So each shift is going to be checks and balances by those supervisors on that shift.
Okay.
To answer your question too, it's a computer algorithm that selects those videos, so that there isn't a human aspect in that. There's a computer program that goes in and does those random selections and spits those out.
Okay, and since it is electronic, on those sorts of things, would that data be, at least like as far as how the incidents are categorized, let's say, or marked or something like that, would that data be immediately available? And is it something that could be made publicly available? I mean, like, we only have the de-escalation incidents, but only for 2018, is that correct? Which is 2 years ago.
We started in 2018.
Okay.
We have them up to now.
Okay.
Garland Pruitt, I see you have your hand raised.
The little incident that just took place, the young man, when they brought him out of the library, he was already handcuffed. He got threw on the ground. He got threw up against the car. All of this now, just like we're talking, someone did video all of it. It's on video from the time they brought him out of the library. And so it goes back to the overly aggressiveness in general is what's dictating the negativity on the end of the things, that situation that we find ourselves in. And when you have that power and that title and that position, de-escalation should be just a given. And I think that's where we're having our major breakdown. Beyond the breakdown in our de-escalation is our documentation. We're seeing that now, just a documentation. So now if the statement is made that anything beyond routine handcuffing would be considered a violation, I would personally say the majority of them are in violation, just based on some of the things that I've seen personally. Now, the most recent thing that just took place on Monday, like I say, someone has that video right now. If we was to submit it based on your guideline, your criteria, that would be considered a misuse of force. Thank you.
I would clarify too. I think one of the things that I'm sorry, Joshua, I was just going to clarify that they didn't say that anything beyond a routine handcuffing is a violation. It's a use of force. And that means it'll be reviewed, but it doesn't mean it's a violation because it's beyond a routine handcuffing. I just wanted to clarify that.
Joshua?
Sorry, once you're made a co-host, you can't raise your hand anymore, or else I would raise my hand in the participants section. You can obviously take that ability away from me, since I don't have to screen share anymore if you need to, Zach. I just had two quick questions. One, when we talk about the FOP contract that you have to review, is that open for the entire task force to review? Or is that contract privy to only the FOP and the police department?
That is public record. It's public record, and I believe it is available.
I would love to. I will email Sharita so I can get a view of that. The other part is when we talk about this use of force committee that reviews this, obviously I would assume that's all police officers. Would an independent monitor on that committee help in terms of providing the community with a little bit more feeling of fairness on that? Some person from the community, kind of not to take or replace the Citizens Advisory Board, but somebody, maybe even a member of the Citizens Advisory Board who sits on that panel to review those videos as well. I think that would be something that maybe could help us in terms of our building relationships with the community. Is that something that you guys would agree with or have reservations about?
I would say that's something that we're going to look at as we get the consultants to come in and take a look at this. I don't think at this point, since we're in the process and we're all going to review this together, it would make more sense to let the consultants come in, bring the best practices and make recommendations and discuss types of things just like what you're raising.
Okay. Any other questions or comments regarding the presentation by Mr. Teal?
I wanted to ask if the second question that I had about our definitions of the use of force, I believe it was, Officer Nelson had mentioned the fact that.
Yeah, I've got it written down for you. I was going to respond to that. Thank you for going back to it. The reason we can say our use of force is the most stringent, in the research that we've done looking around the country, the majority of agencies, what they do on a use of force is they don't work a use of force unless there's a lot of them use the term significant injury. And so that's the only time they would investigate a use of force. So the fact that we do one just for anything beyond the routine handcuffing like Chief Balderrama explained, that's what makes ours more stringent.
And I would say too, that we aren't saying that we've looked at every single department in the country, but when they do research, they're, we're looking at other major departments to try to compare to that, to know what others are doing. So it's more of a generalization of ours are more stringent than what we found in most other departments that we've researched.
Okay, so what was meant, that gives me clarity on just when you say a stringent definition for use of force, we mean that what constitutes, what would, I guess, push us into investigating a use of force incident is incredibly stringent. That is, anything more than a routine handcuffing by the department's definitions is going to be investigated in some way, shape, or form. Okay.
Yes, it basically means they have to notify a supervisor, and then that supervisor comes out to the scene. And so at least, and I'm not saying that a use of force would be investigated in every incident, because sometimes, the officer may be overly cautious in contacting the supervisor, and it may not rise to that use of force level. But there will be, according to the policy, there has to be a supervisor contacted on anything beyond routine handcuffing. And I will say that most of those are investigated. There is a follow-up investigation done.
Joshua, that's the other thing that makes it difficult to compare department by department, because they do things differently. Some departments only will take a use of force if a person is injured. Some will only do a use of force if somebody complains about force. So there's different ways that it's done around the country. So it's kind of hard to compare one department's numbers to another department's numbers because of that disparity and how they classify use of force.
Okay, and if I can just ask one more thing, that was my my worry even when we looked into the de-escalation policy, and the research that, as far as we know, is as up to date as it can be. The conclusions being that we really,
But unfortunately, I had hoped it had been resolved. We don't have IT here at the moment.
No, I don't know if he's having the same issue that I had.
It's looked at like all across the country, not just in policing, right, but in other forms of de-escalation training used by police and others, and it just seems that there's, I guess I wonder, do
we have some rogue out there?
Mr. Uday, you were saying?
I was saying I didn't know if Commissioner
Act team goes out on the incident and is able to make those arrests and talk those people into coming out. That's using de-escalation tactics. That certainly could have been something that was more violent. I don't know about, as far as how we track data, but there's no question that using de-escalation techniques, whether it's you and me having a conversation and us treating each other with respect, I think there's no question that de-escalation tactics work and the training is effective. The questions may be, are there things we need to change in that to increase that? So I think definitely you can come back and point to incidents that we don't hear of any violence because people were arrested without incident because de-escalation tactics were applied.
but each of those would have been noted in the data, right? Because that's, Chief Gurley was reporting the numbers, not of uses of force, but of incidents of de-escalation tactics.
Yes, they would be noted in the data of, it was one where there wasn't a use of force in this case, but I don't know that I don't think there's data on what you're talking about is like, are we looking at every single incident that occurs and then we're documenting something that could have been, could have resulted in use of force, or someone gets in a situation on a traffic stop and it starts getting heated, the officer backs away, or is able to de-escalate, calm the situation. I don't know that there's documentation if there's no incident that occurs out of that. So I'm thinking, with what you're saying, I'm not sure exactly what that tracking of data might look like, but I know there are incidents that we have where we know that people applying what they've learned in de-escalation methodologies is effective in reducing the opportunity for violence in any direction. And so I know it's effective. It's just, I'm not sure about how that data is going to be tracked.
Okay.
And one of the things that we can do, hopefully in the future, as we get further into this, is that when we get consultants on board, is to have them review the way we track our data and see if we are doing it right, wrong, whichever way. So I just throw that out there for comment. The next person that I have up that wants to speak is Nate Tarver.
Thank you, MT. I actually forgot I had push that button. But one of the things that I wanted to also mention to both the Joshuas and everyone else from that matter, when you talk about uses of force and how stringent Oklahoma City is or isn't on their uses of force, what many of the police departments across the nation use is the Department of Justice model, and you are welcome to look at that. And basically what that model is pretty much what Chief Gorley said earlier, that if a subject either complains of injury or there are visible injuries, and that's kind of the standard that they have set. Oklahoma City Police Department, and for those of you who don't know, I was a member of the Oklahoma City Police Department for a while, has, as long as I can recall, gone beyond the Department of Justice model for investigating uses of force. So that kind of muddies the water a little bit more as far as what a definition of use of force is beyond routine handcuffing. So like I said, you can just look up what the Department of Justice says regarding uses of force. And the other thing too about de-escalation techniques, you know, the officers are taught that and they try to utilize that, you know, they should utilize it. However, you know, that's not an end all fix all. It's kind of like crisis intervention training. We've had crisis intervention training and we try to utilize those techniques, but it does not always work with our mental health consumers. So that's just something to consider.
Next up is Joshua Harris Teal.
I think Pastor Cooper was first. I don't want to skip him.
I can call on Pastor Cooper, but you were next in line.
Yeah, mine is real short for City Manager Freeman. When we talk about the research that you guys did in terms of establishing that you have some of the most stringent standards, do you have that research available? Is that something that we can review? And then just further clarification, I understand that we're waiting on the consultant, and this is stuff that we want them to research as well, but kind of my work style is doing the research myself. That way I can figure out what questions that I want to ask. If I can't look at the research and see the totality of it, then I don't know if the questions I'm asking are something that's already answered in the work or something that, you know, wasn't answered in the work and we want to get that clarification on. So not to say that I don't believe anything or anyone's saying, just saying that that's how I work best.
Yeah, I don't know that we've got a study that's pulled together on that. And I think that's something that Puck or Chief or Dexter might be able to answer, or Nate. But what I was trying to reference was that we aren't suggesting that we know what every single department's doing. As we look at different policies, we'll go out and pull policies from other departments and look at those policies to compare, looking for best practices. I don't know if it's all pulled together in one study. I was just trying to point out that we look at a lot of different departments at different times. We don't know what every department does, but we believe we have a more stringent policy than other departments we've looked at. So really, for the most part, our research, we can look to see if we've got something that we pulled together on other policies where we have it compiled that we could share. But otherwise, it's generally something that we're either looking on open records or records that are available online, or contacting departments directly to pull that information. So I don't know if anyone else has, you know, any further information in terms of what studies we've got together or what information that we've pulled on those policies.
Chief Tarver answered that with the Department of Justice guidelines. If you'll look at those, that's what the majority of agencies, larger agencies around the country use. There'll be some variations here and there on how their follow-ups and things are done, but that's what the majority do. They will not start a process involving a use of force and do what we do as far as like notifying a supervisor and those kind of things in most cases, unless they're following those DOJ guidelines, which usually require that someone report an injury or a complaint.
And just a quick follow-up, when you look at different police stations to compare to, is there a certain group of police stations you look at? Is that random? Is that different every time? Or are there kind of some go-tos that you guys would say you examine whenever you're kind of doing this research internally?
We normally use what's called major cities. There's the Major Cities Chiefs Association. You can get online and look at them. It's made of, I forget the numbers, it's like 75, 77 agencies. And Oklahoma City is part of that. Oklahoma City and Tulsa are part of the Major City Chiefs Association. That's where the majority of our research goes, because that's comparing agencies that, you know, while we may not be similar in size, we're at least part of that same group. It's a professional organization.
Thank you so much.
Pastor Cooper? Pastor Cooper, are you still with us?
I think you're muted, Pastor.
Okay, all right. Thank you, MT. My original question has already been answered, but I have a question, and that is on the use of force continuum. As a suspect is apprehended and handcuffed, is there any reason to continue a use of force pattern on a continuum scale? And the question is, even with the incident that Garland had mentioned just at the library, would that, just what you've heard from him, run up any red flags to you in terms of how the officers responded with use of force after the suspect had been handcuffed and then thrown to the ground, slammed up against the car, those kinds of things? Is that necessary for investigation?
I can't really answer a question regarding what Garland's talking about. That's the first I've heard of it. I have no idea what happened in that instance. It'd probably be good if Garland would reach out to us and provide us some specifics when that happened, you know, date, time, location. He mentioned the library, but that way we can pull body camera, or we can at least check at that division, and we can use our CAD history and some other things to identify that particular incident, and then look into it and find out what happened. This is the first I'm hearing of that, so I'm not sure anything about that particular incident.
Well, I don't really, you know, I just want to do it based upon what you've heard from him. Would that draw any red flags for you about use of force in this particular instance? And I could just use it as a hypothetical without you having to speak to that particular situation, because you do not know the details, but just as was described, would that run up some concern for you?
I would want to look into any incident where we used force. What if what Garland is describing occurred just as he said, that is a use of force. That would require notification to the supervisor, and it would most likely, based on if it happened just as described, it would require a use of force investigation. So from a red flag standpoint, I would just want to say that, you know, if things happen just like that, my hope would be they did contact their supervisor, and that process has already started and moving forward as we speak. And so if I can get some particulars on that, I can follow up on that and be able to respond to Garland and let him know, you know, hey, we're already looking into this, or at least provide him some details of the circumstances. We do that all the time.
Garland?
Incident took place on Monday about 4:30 at the library, but I'll make it my business to see whether I can get that tape, the video that someone actually taped it. And so now when you speak of, like you were saying, after in custody, and you bring the person's arm up, back up behind them, which they were already handcuffed, and they start hollering and screaming as they, you know, have them up against the car hollering. I will make it my business to attempt to try to get that film, that video, and provide it to you. But it took place on Monday between 4:30 and 5:30 in the evening at the library. Had at least 4 different police cars came up during a rally that was coming up. Most of them, that the portion that they filmed is, you know, wasn't much, but the portion that one person filmed is from the time that he come out of the library, handcuffed already, to the ground, back up, over the car, back up, to the ground, to in the car. And then after they put him in the car, they drug him back out of the car and put restraints on his legs. So I will make it my business to try to provide you with that video. And so I'm sure that officers work certain areas, so you'll be able to contact exactly who they were. Matter of fact, the particular police car that he rode off in. The young lady said, well, I did get the tag number of the car. So all of that's available for us to be able to provide you with that information. No problem.
You've given me enough. I can find it. If you want to provide that video, we'll definitely look at that. But you've given me enough that I can find out about it, and I'll get back with you.
Garland, I would say that if you can find the video, please do so and send it in to the chief.
All right. I know that I can get it, so I'll make that available.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions?
I think you might see my hand raised there. I would just like some direction as I'm looking and doing research for the Department of Justice to figure out kind of what they're using as definitions and standards. I only see them defining excessive use of force. They don't actually have a definition for use of force, or do you guys feel like those are the same thing? Like, obviously they aren't, because some force being used wouldn't necessarily constitute it being excessive. But since there's only an excessive use of force definition on the DOJ's provided by the DOJ, I kind of just wanted to get some direction. I mean, we can talk about this offline if you guys have a source that you think might be helpful. I really want to make sure that we have a clear foundation of what all of the definitions are, of how we're approaching things, of how we're looking at things. Because if we don't have that established, then I think we're always going to be kind of off kilter here.
I would think that if you would contact either the chief's office or Paco, you all can get that information offline. Okay. In the interest of time, let's move on to our next presentation. That is a presentation on the Oklahoma City Police Department Citizens Advisory Board by Deputy Chief Paco Balderrama.
Thank you very much, Chief Barry. If you would allow me the ability to share my screen, I have a short PowerPoint for this presentation.
Working on it, Paco. Give me just a second.
Good thing.
Okay, you should be good to go.
Thank you. Okay, if you guys can see, let me know if you can see that screen on there. The Citizens Advisory Board, which is commonly known as the CAB, was something that was created. And before I start, let me start with this. The Honorable Robert Jackson, Justice of the Supreme Court, once said, "It is not the function of our government to keep the citizens from falling into error. Excuse me. It is a function of the citizen to keep the government from falling into error." So this is kind of the philosophy behind the CAB, that it is up to the citizens to be in oversight for entities of government, and that includes the police department. There was an incident in 2002 involving a gentleman by the name of Donald Pete, who was engaged in, was basically in a vehicle talking to a woman who was believed to be a prostitute. He was also in possession of marijuana, and an officer engaged him after receiving a call of a suspicious vehicle. And when he tried to get him into custody, he was not able to. Mr. Pete was quite a bit larger than the officer in question, and a use of force ensued, where the officer was forced to use his baton trying to get Mr. Pete to comply. There was video of this incident, and it received a lot of attention, not just locally but nationally. So that was really the genesis, or the catalyst, if you will, for the CAB. Following that, there was various meetings between then Chief of Police M.T. Barry, the District Attorney's Office, members of the clergy for the Northeast community, as well as others, and the Department of Justice. And the result was the creation of the Citizens Advisory Board in 2005. And basically, the duties of the Citizens Advisory Board is to look over completed investigations. These investigations can come from citizen complaints. They can come from allegations of excessive force, police brutality by any department employee, and any other incident which they want to review. They provide comments and suggestions, recommendations to the chief of police on the basis of improving department policy, procedures, and rules. So we also ask them to convene and to attend public forums so they could explain what they do and what role they play. And let me just be very clear that the CAB is an autonomous entity. They basically have a chair and various members, total 9 members, and they run that themselves. The police department does not run it. As I said, 9 members on this board. They do meet every other month. They typically meet at police headquarters. These are not public meetings. They're not announced to the public. Basically, each board member is asked to sign a confidentiality statement. We believe that in order to adequately review any and all investigation, it is very important that we provide them all the information. A lot of the information that they review is not public record. Names, body worn cameras, nothing's, everything's given to them raw. So they're able to really look into the details of the incident and provide a recommendation, and thus it cannot be open to the public because of those reasons. If any citizen wants the CAB to look over any incident, for example, the incident that Garland just described, they can go to our website, okc.gov, and look under Departments, Government. Under the About Us is the Citizens Advisory Board. There you will see a link to an email address where you can send the information. It goes to the CAB, not the police department, so they can look into any matter that they feel should have their attention. Once again, the types of cases that they frequently look at are citizen complaints, formal complaints, allegations of excessive force, police brutality, all in custody deaths, officer involved shootings, and any other incident that they deem is of public concern. For example, there may be an incident that doesn't fall into any of these categories, but perhaps it's on the news or it just reaches a lot of public attention. Well, then the CAB may ask for the information surrounding this incident and also review that one as well. As I said before, they can provide recommendations or voice their concerns to the chief of police. If they feel that the chief of police does not adequately solve or remedy the situation, they can also ask that the city manager look at the incident as well. Basically, in order to be on the Citizens Advisory Board, all you need to do is complete an application, attach your resume to it. There is a background check associated with it, and there is an interview process by the CAB. The CAB selects their own members. The police department does not do that. It is up to the chairperson and the other members of the CAB to select who is going to be part of that group. They do serve on that indefinitely. However, if there's a member who misses more than 3 consecutive meetings without justification, they can also be removed. As far as qualifications, they must be a permanent resident in Oklahoma City, own real property in Oklahoma City, work or maintain a place of business in Oklahoma City, and be engaged with the community. Obviously, good reputation of integrity and community service adds credibility to the CAB as well. So that's something that is required. And no immediate family members can be currently employed by the city manager or be a city employee. We feel that would be a conflict of interest. Also, the members cannot be party of legal representative to any litigation against the city. As far as the breakdown by ethnicity, you can see that it's pretty even split, because it can't be evenly split because it's an odd number, but various cultures, backgrounds are represented as part of the CAB. Mr. Doug White is currently the chairperson, but we do have several members who represent various parts of the community. Ms. Malaka Elizagi, she represents our Muslim community. Don Graham is somebody who's worked very closely with the Southside community. Mr. Mannix Barnes, who is here with us today to answer any questions, and he may want to say a few words. He is a member of the Kiowa tribe. Mr. Robert Everman is a member of the Choctaw tribe. He's been on the CAB for quite some time. Mr. Michael Brooks is a pastor of a Northeast church, and he's also a U.S. Navy veteran. Mr. Jacob Hill has actually assisted the police department in various trainings to include a disability training. You know, after we had the incident with the young man down south who could not, number one, he didn't speak English, and number two, he was deaf, so the officers couldn't communicate. We asked Mr. Hill to help us to come up with some better training in order to train the officers of how to identify somebody who cannot communicate with them. He also sits on our board. Ms. Monica Finley, and I'd like to thank her personally because she is here with us today to answer any questions. And then Ms. Evelyn Cardona, I do believe that she's the most recently added member. She is a native of El Salvador, but is very much involved in our community here in Oklahoma City and the newest member of our board. So that is all that I have as far as the presentation. So I would like to open it up to any questions and also, you know, the two members who are here with us today, Mr. Barnes and Ms. Finley. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you, Paco. I see the first hand as Joshua Higginbotham.
Yeah, my question is why, I mean, it could just be because it's standard on boards of this sort, but why the requirement for a person to own real estate to actually be a member?
Well, you know, there's got to be some connection to Oklahoma City. I mean, this is the Oklahoma City Citizens Advisory Board. So, you know, we feel that they need to have some stake, either live in Oklahoma City, have some kind of stake in the community. I mean, you know, as far as standard, I would think that it'd be really, you know, kind of awkward, maybe inappropriate for somebody from Tulsa to be down here, you know, playing a role.
I mean, a person could like provide evidence that they rent a property, but not own real property. So that's, I mean, you have a lot of people who just rent or live in homes or whatever else. That also means that you could only have, generally speaking, on average, people of either a certain wealth class level that could do that, or people of a certain age.
Okay, I get what you're getting at. That's a good point, and maybe that's something that our consultants could, you know, give some recommendations on.
Okay.
Next hand up is Grace Franklin. Grace.
Let me unmute. Yeah, I have two questions. First question is, how many times has a recommendation from this board, the advisory board, been implemented in the police department? And also, in this background check, what exactly are you looking for in the background check? So if someone had, you know, if you've had a felony of any type, are you not able to? What exactly is the background check? What we background checking?
You know, as far as the your first question, how many times have we implemented one of their recommendations? I don't know. I don't have that information. They do give recommendations and they ask questions. I did fail to point out that there is a non-voting member on the CAB, and it's typically a deputy chief that is appointed by the chief. But basically, we are there to answer any questions about policy and procedure, that sort of thing. But I don't have that information. But that's something that we could find out as far as how many recommendations have been made. As far as the background check, you know, I can't give you a solid answer on that. You know, if we have somebody who has active felony warrants, I mean, that may pose a problem to serve on a board such as this one that's supposed to be reputable and have some integrity. So I would think that's one of the reasons why we look towards that.
Mr. Barnes or Mrs. Finley, if you all want to chime in, just let us know. The next question is coming from George Young.
Thank you, Chief Berry. My simple question, and I don't know who could answer this, but as I look at the description, I was familiar with the CAB. I'm kind of at a loss as to what the heck are we doing? If that board is in place doing what it is supposed to be doing, why would there be a need for this large committee? Why, they seem to be charged with looking at the very things that we are discussing, and they have been in existence for a while, and yet seemingly we're talking about them as if they exist, they're not performing the task, or if that's secret, then we don't need them. So I don't quite grasp their responsibility which seems to be the exact same things that have brought us together as to why. And I'm slow, so you have to help me. Take it slow and easy. Explain to me why that group is not performing the task, or if they are performing the task, it would seem to me to answer a lot of the questions that we are posing right now. So my question is, if that group is up and it's running and it's effective, and I have been familiar with it for a long time, I have to be perfectly honest with you, I don't ever remember hearing anything, and that's me, but again, I'm slow, so don't put that on everybody else, coming out of that group. And I'm not talking bad about the group, the members who are on this call now who are part of that group. I'm not making negative comments about your performance. I'm making negative comments about that performance being relayed to the citizens of Oklahoma so that we might have some idea as to what's really going on with the police department, and have, if we got that kind of access, that all we need to do is to write, go online, file those reports. It would seem to me I would have more folk talking to me about, well, man, you know what, I got great response for our police department because I went through the cab. So my concern is, help me put together why we are on these days for 3 hours when there's a group that's meeting that seemed to me, so clarify for me, that seems to me doing the same thing that we have been charged to do.
I think that's a really good question and a good point that's really, I think, very important to make. And we probably should have made this point when we first started this, that anything that's being done right now with this group should not at all be seen as any kind of negative reflection on any of the members of our Citizen Advisory Board. When all of this started, the mayor sat down with a group from Black Lives Matter, and they had conversations about the process and some of the policing issues and the relationship, race relations, especially with the department, some of the issues with use of force. And in those conversations, the request was made that they agreed together that we would form a task force of a broad scope or broad representation of the community to take a look at some of these. The question wasn't about the work that the individuals who are on the Citizen Advisory Board was doing. The questions really became, have we empowered that group enough? Do they need to have more power than what they have? Does there need to be more reporting out of what comes, the results that come from that? So the question wasn't to go back to that Citizen Advisory Board or to disband the Citizen Advisory Board or to make any question of what they're doing. It was, let's step back and take a broader look, get a broad representation of the community, just to come in and look at those two primary areas, which being our Citizen Advisory Board and our de-escalation policy being the two primary areas of focus. And so it was just to have a broad group from the community take a look at this, working with a consultant to look at our process and see if there's something that we need to update in that.
Can I have a follow-up, Chief Berry?
Go right ahead.
Well, I hear that, and that's great. Broader, larger group looking at it, that's fine and dandy. So, and I'm way down the road now. So once that occurs, why then are we then going to report to the CAB so that they can report then to the police department, or are we what we do? Because it seems like the CAB would be much more abreast of information, knowledge, and cooperation working with the Oklahoma City Police Department to know, you got me wanting to look at a consultant coming in that we're going to pay big hunks of money to, and to come up with something that I'm a part of this committee, but I'm not directly a part of. When the CAB is there all the time dealing with those issues, I want to hear from them. That's what I want to hear from. I want to go to their meetings and talk to them about what they're seeing happening in Oklahoma City in connection with the Oklahoma City Police Department. Because the incident that Garland just produced, it seemed to me, what a great group to take that to, and you know what, we get some results back from that with those. It's a great, I like the way they cut it, the way they set the group up. So I'm just having a little problem, and I appreciate the explanation, Craig, but I'm still having a little problem with understanding my need to be, except for the information. I love the information. Chief Gorley and I have talked, and obviously Chief Berry and I have talked for years and years and years. So he's not that old, but for years and years, but we have talked a long time. But so I'm questioning, and Paco, we talked, so but I hope I got a legitimate question that Craig, I'm saying, I know you tried to answer it, but I'm still wondering, this is a hunk of a time to be spending on something that another group
Yeah.
has the authority and information to work on.
I think it's a good point that, I mean, one, this committee is going to carry forward. The mayor created this task force, sat down with Black Lives Matter. They agreed we would create the task force. He went to great efforts to make sure we had broad representation there. The intent really was never to cut out the Citizen Advisory Board. They continue in their function just as it is right now. But I think your point of, as we're going through this and doing this review, us as a task force having interaction directly with that Citizen Advisory Board to get their input and feedback, I think is going to be really valuable to the group.
Let's move on and let Joshua Teal, who is a member of the Black Lives Matter organization and was one of those, I believe, who met with the mayor, and let him have some comments at this point.
Chief Berry, just real quick, if I could, and I don't have to interrupt Mr. Teal, but to go to kind of what Senator Young was talking about, if we could hear from Mr. Barnes and Ms. Finley that are here, I think they might be able to provide some context too, as actual members of the CAB. And I mean, I'm willing to defer until Mr. Teal speaks, but I just want to make sure they get on the process too, because I think that applies to what Senator Young is talking about.
It is my intention to allow either one of those two or both to speak. Mr. Teal, you'd like to go ahead now?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. So I guess a couple quick things, and I definitely want to make sure I get to Senator Young's question. One, the background check is kind of something that I have some further questions about, and I think me and Paco can connect with this, because when we think about property ownership, the majority of Oklahoma City doesn't own property, right? And so that is something that might be a barrier, but also kind of what are the backgrounds that we're looking for? Is this intended to have like a layman's view of these incidents and not have necessarily a legal background? Is there training that these people are receiving when they're on the board? That's definitely something the folks who are on that board can speak to. A lot of why we had the meeting in the first place was not necessarily that the Citizens Advisory Board was ineffective or really anything negative about the Citizens Advisory Board at all. It was that the general public doesn't necessarily have a good understanding of what that board does, who all sits on it, what abilities and capabilities they have, and then what powers they have. So when we look at our Citizens Advisory Board, especially in terms of like the legal subpoena powers, is that something that they need to have in order for them to be a little more effective or to have more teeth? When we, there was actually, I was looking at an interview that was done by Chairman White for that board, and he said that they've never had a ruling against the police and that the police usually do a really great job with it. But when you do a breakdown of what happens if they do disagree with the police officers, then that goes to the city manager, and then the city manager speaks with the chief or puts pressure on the chief to like reinvestigate it, as is my understanding. But then there's also some issues with that relationship based on the FOP contract on what exactly can and can't happen in those scenarios. And then the arbitration that says that some officers, even if they've been removed, that arbitration can replace them into their position as a police officer. So when we ask the question about why this task force is created, it has less to do with the Citizen Advisory Board, who, again, for all intents and purposes, is doing a phenomenal job at what they're doing, and more to do with the culture that exists around Oklahoma City, the relationships that exist between OKCPD and the public, and the issues that we have seen growing across this country in terms of officer interactions with community members, especially those that result in death. When our community stood up and said, you know, we are demanding accountability, we're demanding transparency, there were a number of things that they were identifying that don't already exist. And though we are not, you know, obviously OKCPD is not the officers that killed George Floyd, to make sure that we are above reproach, we have to be intentional and taking our time, finding out what we're doing well, what we need to be doing better, and establishing from a public perspective and a public view how we can increase the trust in the OKCP Police Department, or the Oklahoma City Police Department. So that's a couple of the different things that I have. And again, those questions, again, we can touch base after offline, Paco, but around the background check, around the what perspective, around what training they're receiving, and then around what powers they have, and then also the contract. And maybe you can speak to this, City Manager Freeman, that says that if they have a disagreement with the police, that goes to you, what exact powers you have in that situation to either agree or disagree. If you do agree with the Citizens Advisory Board, what then happens from there? So that can be something that, and also just in general, what are we doing to make sure our public knows about the Citizens Advisory Board, like Senator Young said, to have that information getting to the public?
Okay, before we go much further, I don't want to get too far away from Senator Young's questions. Next in line, I show is Grace Franklin and then Gloria Torres, but I'm going to stop right now and find out if either of the members of the Citizens Advisory Board that are with us today would like to make a comment on anything that's been said or asked so far.
Mr. Berry, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay. One, I want to first tell you how much I appreciate you all inviting me to this forum. I think it's very important that you know exactly what our Citizens Advisory Board does. I'm one of the first members of this. I was appointed in 2005. We went before an interview process. Mr. Garland Pruitt, Reverend Lee Cooper, Mr. Roosevelt Melton, Milt Combs, and it was extensive interviews when we first established the CAB. And, you know, we have 9 members. And, you know, one of the things that was very important to this group and very important to the police department at the time was confidentiality. And we haven't had one incident since this group was formed breaking that confidentiality. We're dealing with a lot of personnel issues with police officers. And so we've got a very good group that we have assembled. We've lost a few along the years, but we've replaced them with good people. Our recent 2 members are young ladies that I believe are going to do a great job. They've attended, I think this is their 3rd meeting with us and as members of the CAB. What I want to do is, first of all, and I want to answer Senator Young, and it's nice to see you, Senator Young, by the way. His question, Mr. Teal's, why does most citizens, not know about the CAB? Well, we operate off of a zero-based budget. We're volunteers who come in on Saturday. We're not professional marketing people. This is something that we're hoping that the city understands. I mean, it's kind of like the Mask Up campaign of where money is being spent to promote that, which is great. But it also needs to promote that this CAB is available for citizens who have complaints. And so I think this is very critical because it's either up to the CAB or up to the police department to promote this. And this is something that has not been done that probably I recommend to the city to make sure that that gets out to everyone in Oklahoma City, that we're available to receive their complaint and investigate it. I want to answer Ms. Franklin's question that she had with regard to the recommendations. Yes, we have. We've made several recommendations, and this is why I'm so proud of CAB. We virtually, when we first started, we were basically just listening to a review from Internal Affairs that says, here's the case, here's what we did. That wasn't good enough for us. We went through and we said, no, we want to review the file. We want to look at the complete file. Again, when you're dealing with the FOP, and I see Mr. George on there, and I'm just being upfront and honest, he's got a job to do, and I understand that. So there's back and forth. So this is over several years that we've been able to get little by little what we believe we need to be able to review these cases. So the second part, we got parts of the file. The second part, we ended up finally getting a complete file. Then we wanted to look at interview statements, okay? These are things that weren't provided to us at the very beginning. This is over a course of time and working with not only the police department, the city manager, the mayor, the FOP to get this done. then we wanted to look at pictures, because if one of the citizens said, hey, he struck me, and then the police officer says, no, this person struck, we wanted to see pictures to see where the marks were on the different individuals' faces. So we were able to do that. Then we went to videos. And so we were finally able to look at videos, which has helped tremendously. Then the body worn cameras come in. This was another fight, but guess what? We get to look at body worn cameras. This has probably been the most telling to be able for us to look at these cases and be able to make quick decisions. And then to me, the best thing that we have been able to accomplish as a group is we finally were able to make the police department provide past offenses. Okay, this was critical because when we looked at different cases and we wanted to know that, did this police officer commit any of these in the past? Well, I think that was very important, and Chief City and Chief Gorley's been very cooperative on providing those past offenses. So whenever we review a case, we're looking at that officer's past offenses and looking at it if it's been committed before or not. The other thing that we're wanting to work on that we haven't got accomplished that we want to look at, which I realize the FOP is going to be indifferent on it, but whenever there's an interview of, say, a involved shooting, police involved, they get to go and wait. I think it's 48 or 72 hours before investigators can interview that police officer. I don't necessarily agree with that, just because it happened at that scene and at that time. And I think, people tend to forget, or people tend to not remember things after that. I think it's very important that we make sure that we interview at that scene at the time that there's an officer involved shooting. Now, that's something that's indifferent that the FOP doesn't agree with. And I understand that, and I understand Mr. George's position. I'm just telling you from our view as a CAB member, that's problematic for us, because we like to look at people's statements, because everybody else gets interviewed at the scene, but there's a period of a waiting period before you can interview an officer that was involved. That's something I think can be looked at. The other thing that's very important that we made recommendations to is we can pull and review files at any time. So if Mr. Pruitt decides, say, hey, I had something from 2018, guess what? As a member or as a chairman of this, we can go and ask Chief Gorley that we want to look at this file. When I was chairman, I looked at 5 or 6 different files that were not reviewed that Saturday that I could go back in there and look at videos, look at pictures, and I did that with Chief Scully. So these are things that we have done, that we have accomplished over the years. And so, it's one of those things that I'm not sure really everybody understands what we do. I'm welcome, I welcome anybody to ask any questions, and if I haven't answered that, I hope to be able to do that. But we, like I said, volunteer our time on Saturdays. We meet sometimes quarterly. We'll review anywhere from 15 to 16 cases. Those cases normally involved, officer-involved shootings, excessive force, in custody deaths, and administrative investigations. If there's an investigation that we really feel like is important with regard to, let's just say that there's theft with regard to a police officer, that's something that we'd like to look at. Now, have we made recommendations that we did not agree with over the years? We have, and we've sent those to Chief City. Those are things that with regard to, again, the FOP and the arbitration process, I mean, I agree with Mr. Teal. When you talk to chiefs around the country, you talk to Chief Gorley, Chief City, they do not want bad police officers on the street. Also, police officers don't want another bad police officer on the street. But there's a process that I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm just telling you from what we reviewed, the percentage is very high that those bad officers are going to go right back on the street. Our CAB members don't agree with that. These are things that we have submitted in writing, that we do not agree with this officer being put back on the force. It wasn't the chief that did it. It's when it goes through the arbitration process and they're right back in there. And I'm just letting you know that's just how the system works. I don't agree with it, but that's what we're faced up against until there's changes made on that end.
Okay, thank you, Mannix. Monica, did you want to say anything at this point?
Yeah, yes, I did. Thank you very much for having me today. And I want to say, excuse me in the beginning right now. One of the perks from working from home, my neighbor across the street decided to work on his car. So you may hear that in the background. I just wanted to speak in regards to being a new member. I am also one of the two new members that are on the board for it. So I just wanted to speak from that perspective. I became a member here in 2020. And I just wanted to speak in regards to my experience so far and that type of thing. I wanted to say that it's very positive. I wanted to say that we do look at trends and opportunities for improvements that we do give inside of the meeting when we see different films and video cam and that kind of thing, and different suggestions on ways that things that can be improved. I will say the police department has been receptive in regards to going and listening to our feedback and coming back with a yay or a nay in terms of what they can do and what they can't do. I know that as a board member, between the board members, we do have very diverse backgrounds. So we are able to have different points of view in regards to discussion and things to bring up that maybe someone maybe not have thought of, or maybe have a skewed perspective on something. So we are able to bring up other angles to a particular situation that may happen. So that is another thing that we do. One thing that we don't cover is that we do have an opportunity to have trends and to have ways that we go and say, these are things that maybe need to be addressed and stuff, but we don't necessarily address the policy that may need to take place in order to get things to be in there as part of the training system. So maybe this is where this task force could, come into play. I know we evaluate things after incidents have happened, so we can see that if something is being repeated or okay, this person has been pulled over in this type of manner and I'm seeing a trend on this, we bring that up to them, but maybe there's some type of policy that the task force could come up with in terms of training or, things to work on. So I didn't really have a ton of comments, but I just wanted to speak in regards to a new member and what I've experienced so far. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Monica. Now for the group, let me give you a rundown on the people who want to speak and what order I have them in. Next up would be Grace Franklin. After that, Gloria Torres. Next would be Garland Pruitt. And then Valerie Thompson would be number 4. So at this point, Grace, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to come back around to my question because I'm very familiar with what the CAB does. I actually think what they do is important because they have access to confidential information and information that as the public we will never see because they deal with internal police issues. I think that my question is about the recommendations that they have provided. How many times has the police department implemented the changes that they recommended? How many times has it also been escalated? Because if we have a body that has the information, confidential information that we'll never have, who makes recommendations, and those recommendations are not being implemented, then I think this task force can then talk about how we can give or how this may need to be restructured so that the CAB can have that power. There is no need to recreate a wheel, but we may need to change the shape of it a bit. We may need to do some things so the CAB can do what they need to do. The other concern is, of course, we know that there are going to be issues with the FOP, not because they're a horrific entity, but because they are trying to protect officers in their rights, right? As a worker, they don't want to feel run over or anything like that, or put out on the limb. But at the same time, with every job, there has to be accountability. With every job, there has to be an arm that can say, hey, maybe you need to sit down for a while, officer, while we do some investigation and get desked. There has to be a way for either certain allegations, certain instances where the CAB has power to act in a way that they don't have now. So I'm hoping that this task force is looking at that for the CAB, that we are looking at ways to structure it in a way that this already existing body, who, you know, we may have to talk about the background check, you know, we have to talk about some things, but that this existing body who has access to confidential information can be a little more effective in their recommendations since they do have access. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Now, before we go on to the next speaker, I'd like to ask for responses to Grace's question.
Yes, Mr. Berry, and that's kind of what I went over. We have made several recommendations over the years of being able to review the file, the complete file that was met with regard to pictures, videos, past offenses, body-worn cameras. But I want to make it clear that our intent when we reformed had nothing to do with ever solving personnel issues, because we would be there every day if we were there on a panel to deal with personnel issues. And that would be, you know, problematic. I know Mr. George with the FOP would have a problem with that. And I think probably our CAB members would have a problem with that. You know, we weren't put in place to solve the police department's personnel issues. We just were there to look it over and make recommendations on after the fact of how they were solved. And yes, we have made recommendations and disagreed with some of those recommendations with regard to how they handled those. A lot of times we'll do that in writing, or we'll do it verbally with the chief. Sometimes we'll have a meeting and then we'll have another meeting and call the chief to come and answer our questions of why this was handled that certain way. Many of the times we find out later that it was handled in arbitration and the police officers were sent right back on the street, even though the chief did not want to put them back on the street. He recommended termination. And so these are just issues that we deal with when we come, you know, every Saturday to review. But that's the reason I'm saying I'm very proud, because this has been a work in progress over 15 years to get everything that we've got today. I mean, from the complete file to the videos, it's not just an automatic when you form a committee. And I've worked with Mr. Pruitt, I've worked with Milt Combs, I've worked with Roosevelt Milton, I've worked with several leaders who went back in and talked to the police, talked to the mayor, talked to several things, because we've met over the years and we've said, hey, I want this file. You know, we can't solve anything without. So I hope that answers your question.
I do want to say one thing. My question about how many times that it's been implemented to the police department is not for the CAB, it's for the police department. That question is towards them. I know full well that the CAB makes recommendations. I'm pretty familiar with you all and what you do. My question is more so for the police department. Like, how many times have you all received a recommendation either about an instance or about a complaint about the officer itself, and how many times have they moved with that recommendation? And also, just sidebar, I think a complaint against an officer from a citizen is not necessarily a personnel issue, but it is going to be an accountability and discipline issue. And that, you know, would have to be addressed. But yeah, I just want to clarify that. It's not towards the CAB. It's really, I just want to know from the police department, so I can be clear, and the city manager, how many times, you know, it's implemented. And y'all might not have that right now. Fully understand. Just look for something I'm looking for. Thank you.
And Ms. Franklin, that's something that we're going to have to look and research. I don't have that answer for you, and I'm just hoping that we've kept that information as far as how many recommendations have been made, and you know, how many policies have been implemented based on their recommendation. But we'll try to get that for you. And this PowerPoint will also be available for the members of this task force.
Okay, next question up is from Gloria Torres. Gloria, you still with us? Gloria Torres, are you still with us?
Looks like she's unmuted, but I'm not hearing her speak. I mean, I know she's trying to. No, we can't hear you, Gloria.
Unfortunately, Gloria, we can't hear you.
You might have to reset your audio. You can, at the bottom, there's a little arrow. You can use that arrow to turn off or disconnect completely your audio and reconnect it, and that should do the trick for you.
Okay,
Yeah,
I think Gloria is saying go ahead to the next person. That would be Garland Pruitt.
Yes, my concern, well, first I'd like to make a recommendation. Now we've got a minimum with three different task force: the governors, the mayors, the city, citizen advisory board. That the citizen advisory board need to be a part of this committee. That would be my recommendation. Now I understand that when challenging, I'll say for instance, they got an issue, they take it before the city council or take it before the police department and they don't get what they want. Citizen advisory board needs subpoena power to be able to challenge those particular positions, just as they made mention of. They'll go against the recommendation of the police department of the city. If the city chief took a different position than the FOP, they need to have some recourse in order to get their issue addressed. Now I can recall a few years ago where it ended up had an incident with the police and the other undercover agents, and they had a tendency to not want to allow us to be able to see that particular information. And they claimed that they couldn't do it based on these were undercover agents and they were not able to show who they were. After conversation and dialogue, we understood and knew that all they had to do was dedact their faces. And they ended up taking the recommendation and doing that. Input from citizens is mandatory when it's going to fix, change, and correct the situation we find ourselves in. Everything that we're doing right now is to make a better city, a better community, and have better working relationships and have less people die. So FOP, we understand they're under contract. Certain things still have to be fixed, changed, and corrected. In order for us to move forward as this committee and any other committee, changes has to be made. They have to be made. If we number 2, we want to be number 12 or 22. And the only way you're going to get that change, fixed it and corrected, is you have to do something different. If everything was working perfectly and fine and in order and decent, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. We're trying to get off number 2 and become 22 immediately. And the only way you're going to do that is change the attitudes as well as the behavior. And to change the attitude and the behavior, we got to get something on paper as far as policy to hold people accountable for what's happening. We wouldn't be here if everybody was doing everything they're supposed to do. Citizen Advisory Board is needed, necessary, and I think they need to be a part of this committee beyond where we're at this point.
Thank you, Garland, for your recommendation and comment. Next up is Valerie Thompson.
Good afternoon. I know the hour is getting late, so I won't carry out the meeting, but I do just a couple of points that I want to make. I want to applaud the work of the Community Advisory Board. I think my big takeaway is that they do a lot of good work, but that may not be communicated to the general public. And as we talk with our potential consultant, whoever that may be in the interview process, I've been on a lot of interview processes with the city when you're going through the RFP process. I think that's important to maybe understand how they would plan to unpack how we communicate with the general public, with our community advisory board, because in 15 years, I think they've done some really good work, but we need to share that story. And then the other thing I would also say as part of that task force, the gentleman did kind of share what the process is with the city. But to MT's point earlier about the data, I believe data collection and how we look at how we're collecting different data is going to be very important, and really would like to know what type of skill sets that potential consultant would have in helping us assess the data and how we can be better as a city in collecting our data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. Next up is John Mindendorf.
Thank you, Chief Barry. Given what Ms. Franklin said about accountability and discipline, I wonder if the existence of this task force doesn't give us, even though we have sort of a narrow scope, I wonder if it wouldn't give us an opportunity with the help of people like Senator Young to speak into the possibility of legislation that might give Chief Gorley a freer hand as it has to do with discipline and accountability within the police department. Because as I understand it, that would not just be a city issue. If we're dealing with the contract, that would also be a state law issue. Am I right about that, Senator Young or Chief Gorley?
Chief Barry, is it all right for me to respond?
Yes, go right ahead.
I think a state law could not suit the problem. I think with what you are really addressing is between the Oklahoma City and the FOP. That I think is that contract. I can't propose legislation to interfere with that contract. So, and I assume that's what you're talking about when you say trying to help them with personnel issues. That's an agreement that within the scope of that contract between those two entities. And I can't imagine a state law, because we try to preach not taking power away from the cities. We want cities to be empowered to do what they need to do. I want the Oklahoma City Police Department to be empowered to do what it's supposed to do. And I don't want to dictate that from 23rd and Lincoln. And so I don't even like bringing it up, because I don't want the legislature impacting things of that nature. Now, there are other obviously things that we control and things that we ought to have a say so on, but those particular issues, when it comes to a city making decisions what's best for its and its law enforcement needs, that's a little bit outside I want for our state legislature. And that could be just me, but I can't see us producing a legislation that would help Chief Gorley. Let me just say it like that. I think it would be more of a detriment.
Pastor, the things that I think that you're talking about on the state level would probably be the Police and Fire Arbitration Act, which does require collective bargaining and require mandatory arbitration on disagreements between the police department and the labor union that supports the police employees.
Okay, thank you.
Gloria, are you able to talk yet?
Gloria, to follow up what Joshua said, in the left where it says mute or unmute, there's a little arrow that points up. And if you click that, maybe choosing the option same as system will allow you to use your computer microphone.
Zach, I think Gloria was saying that she's on her phone. Does that change anything with the instructions that you're providing?
Let me pull up the app, sir. Hold on just a second.
It changes it, I believe, to your top left-hand corner, but it's still the same microphone button. You hit the microphone, there's an option there.
Gloria is waving us off, so.
Yeah, she is too.
We tried, Gloria, I'm sorry. Any other questions or comments before we move to the last item on our agenda? I would really, really, really like to thank everybody who provided input today. I think this has been a very meaningful meeting. I think it's been a very productive meeting, and it gives us some direction to go in the future, which is what I'm sure we all wanted to see happen. In saying that, we have been trying to determine the best way to establish a meeting date for us, trying to consider everybody's varying schedules. We've come to the conclusion that we're just probably going to have to pick a date every month or to have this meeting, and then have people try to adjust their schedules as appropriate to be there. And so in regards to that, Craig, did you have anything else that you wanted to say
Yeah.
about that?
So we'd originally said in here our next meeting would be October 21st, but I think we'd gotten feedback from several of the board or the task force members saying that really it would be better if we knew and we had a schedule going out that's like a regular monthly meeting or bi-monthly or whatever. We're going to go ahead and get a schedule together. So we're going to change that from right now being October 21st. We still want it to be in that week if possible, but then we want to be able to set it so that we'll set the next meeting and then go ahead and you'll know every month going forward what our regular meetings are. If we get in a situation because of timing of something with a contract with a consultant or anything like that, that we need to call a special meeting or have smaller meetings, we can deal with those ad hoc, but we want to have a regular task force meeting that's scheduled so that you all can put it in your schedules. I think that'll be more respectful of your schedule as a whole. Hopefully we'll be able to schedule them far enough out that it'll let everyone participate and be a part. So we will take care of that and get that going forward. We had several of the members who pointed that issue out to us over the last few weeks, and we're going to get on that right now to try to get that scheduled very soon.
And the next thing that I'd like to say is that I really appreciate City Manager Craig Freeman and Assistant City Manager Kenny Soodle being with us today. They unfortunately been victims of the COVID-19 situation, but they are back and look strong and ready to go. So we've been praying for you and glad to have you back.
Thank you, MT. I wanted to say again too, one, I do appreciate everyone's comments and just really the way, we're going to disagree as we go through this task force, but the way everyone really seems, everyone focused on solutions, and we're committed to that. I appreciate the police department, Chief Gorley's leadership, that we're committed to working with the community and working to see this to be successful going forward. And I wanted to mention too, that I want to just thank Mannix and Monica for being with us today from the Citizen Advisory Board. We're going to take all of the suggestions and comments that were made. I think the comments about needing to be, us taking responsibility as a city to make sure we're being more open about communicating with the public. There's a lot of really good suggestions that have been made today that we're going to take to heart. I'm going to do everything I can to be at the next Citizen Advisory Board and sit down and talk with the Citizen Advisory Board about some of these issues. We look forward to working with you all in the future, but I really appreciate you all giving us even more of your time than you already do to be a part of the task force today.
I just got notified that John George was wanting to speak. John, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I just want to address 2 or 3 things, and I won't keep us much longer. Feel free for anybody to reach out to me and talk about these issues more in depth, but just some things that were brought up over the last couple of meetings. I jotted down. We talk about qualified immunity. I want people to understand qualified immunity does not keep us from being sued. It keeps us from being sued when we're working within the scope of our employment or our training. If we're outside that scope, we can be sued individually, and that's happened here. So it does not keep us from being sued in totality. It's as long as we're working in scope in our employment and training, then we're covered under that. Arbitrations and terminations. Let's sit here today and it made it kind of sound like that we're overturning those left and right and we got all these guys getting terminated. I've been FOP president for 8.5 years. I think we just went to the first termination arbitration at 8.5 years that we're currently waiting for a ruling on that. So we don't do that. That's kind of a misconception. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years, I think we've averaged 2 arbitrations a year, and maybe just one has been a termination one that we hadn't even got the ruling back on yet. So that's not something that happens all the time. It's actually a rare occurrence. What else was there? Oh, the 48-hour wait period as far as being interviewed. That actually has changed. Several years ago when I was in homicide, we actually did interviews that night immediately. And we went to some training, the FOP did, the department sent people to training, and they realized that you actually recall things better when you wait longer and you get a better interview. And I want to make people clear that actually the officers don't have to give an interview at all if they don't want to. They're under a criminal investigation at that point. They have the right as every citizen. They don't even have to give an interview. But because we do police officers and we want our story out there, we voluntarily give those interviews. We don't even have to give them, but we do that. And the other two thing that I've heard a lot about this study, we're number 2, and I think it's, I don't know exactly how it's worded, number 2 in officer involved shootings in the country per capita. And it's not saying we're number 2 in unjustified shootings. I think we may be focusing on some of the wrong things. And I'm not saying that we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we may be looking at the root wrong of what's being number 2 may not be necessarily what the police officers are doing wrong. It may be some community issues. It may be our mental health laws here and the funding we have for mental health. It may be our the drug abuse here. Again, not saying we're perfect, not saying we don't make mistakes, but because we're number 2 in this doesn't mean it's a police department problem. It could be what is causing us and what are causing our officers to be put in those situations where they have to use deadly force. And that's what we need to be looking at. So I just wanted to bring all that up because I've been trying to take all this in the last couple of meetings. FOP is always willing to talk to anybody, and anybody wants to talk more in depth about that, I'm always willing. So that's really all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you chiming in. Very good points. Okay. I don't have anything else. I think at this point, it's time for us to adjourn. Thank you each and every one for your input today, and we'll see you at our next meeting.
Thanks, everyone.